It happened at one of the most prestigious technology conferences in New York City, where the brightest minds in artificial intelligence and robotics had gathered. You know the type. A place where sharp suits, cutting-edge research, and big ideas about the future fill every conversation. People had flown in from all across the country to discuss how AI would change the world. But what nobody expected was that one of the most unforgettable moments of that day wouldn't come from a scientist or a tech mogul. It would come from a young man named Barron Trump. Now, when folks first saw Barron sitting quietly in the back of that massive conference hall, many of them whispered to each other, "What's he doing here? Is this just because of his famous last name?" Some even chuckled under their breath, assuming he wouldn't have much to say in a room full of experts. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Barron wasn't just there to observe. He had earned his place through hard work, top-level academic achievements, and a growing reputation in AI research. But more importantly, Barron carried with him something even more rare in that room, a deep and unshakable faith in God, a belief that, in a world obsessed with machines and logic, still had meaning and purpose. And while others were busy showing off their intelligence and debating how far AI could go, Barron was about to prove that courage, faith, and reason could stand together, even when everyone around you thinks otherwise. Little did they know, by the end of the day, it wouldn't be Barron's name people remembered. It would be his words. Now let me introduce you to the man at the center of this story, Dr. Jonathan Blake. Dr. Blake is not just any professor. He's a world-renowned expert in artificial intelligence, celebrated in universities and tech conferences across the country. He's written best-selling books on AI and the future of humanity, books that have made him famous but also controversial. You see, Dr. Blake has built his reputation not only on his knowledge of AI but also on his public attacks on religion and people of faith. To him, belief in God is nothing more than a fairy tale, something he never hesitates to say out loud. At nearly every event he speaks at, he makes sure to include some sharp joke or biting comment aimed at believers. For Dr. Blake, mocking faith isn't just a side note, it's part of his identity as a so-called modern thinker. He often starts his lectures by saying, "If anyone here still believes in God, I hope you packed a thick skin." And then he laughs, while the audience, usually made up of young students eager to impress, laughs along. But behind all his jokes and clever comebacks, Dr. Blake hides something else, a deep need to prove that faith has no place in the modern world. To him, religion belongs to the past, and technology, especially AI, is the future. He calls AI the new creator, and anyone who disagrees is, in his words, living in the dark ages. So when Barron Trump walked into that conference hall, a young man known to hold strong Christian beliefs, Dr. Blake saw what he thought would be an easy target, someone to make fun of. Someone he could use to show off his so-called superior intellect. But little did Dr. Blake know, the real lesson that day would be his to learn, not Barron's. As the conference hall filled with some of the brightest minds in technology, a quiet buzz of excitement filled the room. Men and women in sharp suits and lab coats gathered, ready to hear Dr. Jonathan Blake, one of the most famous AI scientists in the country, deliver his keynote address. Known for his cutting-edge work and sharp tongue, Dr. Blake had a reputation for mocking religion in nearly every public speech he gave. The topic of his speech that day? Why artificial intelligence will replace all ancient myths, including God. As he walked up to the podium, a confident smirk played on his lips. Adjusting his glasses, he glanced at the crowd, and many waited in anticipation, some because they admired him, others because they expected fireworks. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Blake began, pacing slowly as though he owned the room, "we live in an age where machines can write poetry, diagnose diseases, and even compose music. And yet," he paused for dramatic effect, "some still cling to the idea of an invisible God watching us from the clouds, as if we're living in a children's fairy tale." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Dr. Blake smiled wider, knowing he had their attention. Then, with a click of his remote, a graph lit up on the screen behind him. Bold letters read, "Higher intelligence, lower faith." The graph showed a sharp decline, suggesting that the smarter a person is, the less likely they are to believe in God. He turned, looking straight at Barron Trump, who was sitting quietly near the front taking notes. "Of course," Dr. Blake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Some might argue that family tradition makes it harder to accept modern truths, even when the evidence is overwhelming." His gaze lingered on Barron for a long moment, making sure everyone knew who he was talking about. A few awkward chuckles followed. Continuing, Dr. Blake gestured broadly as though lecturing a room full of naive children. "The truth is simple," he said. "God is an idea that helped primitive societies explain what they couldn't understand, like why the sun rises or where lightning comes from. But now we have science, we have AI, and let me be clear, intelligence and faith do not go together." As he spoke, many in the room nodded, but a few, like Barron, sat still, their eyes narrowing, quietly preparing for what would come next, something Dr. Blake never saw coming. As the room sat in silence, with everyone processing the professor's latest insult, something unexpected happened. Barron Trump stood up. He didn't stand abruptly or angrily. He stood with quiet confidence, the kind that makes people take notice without a word. His posture was straight, his gaze steady, and his hands calmly resting at his sides. The room, which had been filled with snickers and murmurs just moments before, suddenly grew silent. All eyes turned to him. In a voice that was both calm and firm, Barron began, "With all due respect, Dr. Blake, I believe that if we are going to have an honest, intellectual discussion, it should be based on reason and respect, not mockery." You could almost feel the air shift in that moment. Some students looked at each other in surprise. They had expected Barron to sit quietly, maybe even shrink under the professor's remarks. But here he was, standing tall and addressing one of the most intimidating intellectuals in the room, and doing it with dignity. Barron paused briefly, making sure his words sank in. Then he continued, "It's easy to stand up here and ridicule people of faith, to call them weak or uneducated. But is that real courage? Or is that simply taking the easy road, attacking something you've already decided to dismiss without truly engaging with it?" A ripple went through the audience. You could see a few heads nodding, and even a couple of raised eyebrows from faculty members who had been sitting quietly until now. Still calm, Barron went on, "You say that faith in God is irrational, but let me ask you this. What is more irrational? Believing that this entire universe, with its precise laws and incredible beauty, was created by a higher intelligence, or believing that all of this just appeared by accident from nothing with no purpose at all?" As he spoke, Barron's voice didn't waver. There was strength in his calmness, a kind of steady conviction that wasn't about winning an argument, but about standing up for what he believed to be true. By now, even those who had laughed earlier were listening, really listening, perhaps for the first time in a long while. Barron took a deep breath and looked directly at Dr. Blake, his calm demeanor standing in sharp contrast to the tension filling the room. His voice, though soft, carried a firmness that silenced even the whispers in the back row. "Dr. Blake," Barron began, "I appreciate the importance of science and what it has accomplished. Like you, I admire the great minds that have built the world we live in today. But with all due respect, I don't think science has or ever will answer every question that matters." He paused, glancing briefly around the hall. "You argue that because we can build machines that think, it somehow proves there's no need for God. But let me ask you this. If AI can mimic thought, does that mean it can love? Can it sacrifice itself for another being? Can it create beauty that stirs the soul or feel compassion for someone in pain?" A few heads in the audience turned, exchanging glances as if they had never considered that angle before. "You see, machines may process data and solve problems, but they can't understand meaning," Barron continued. "They don't cry when they see injustice. They don't feel awe when looking at the stars. Yet we do. Why? Where does that come from? Are we nothing more than highly advanced biological algorithms? Or is there something deeper? Something that science can't measure?" His voice grew a little stronger as he went on. "We talk about AI being intelligent, but it doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't ask, why am I here, or what is right and wrong. But humans do. Even a child asks those questions. And why? Because, unlike machines, we were created to seek meaning beyond ourselves. Now the room was listening intently. Some students who had been chuckling earlier were now leaning forward in their seats. Dr. Blake, Barron said, "You suggest that believing in God is for people who don't understand science. But I believe it's possible to love science and still believe in God. In fact, many of the greatest scientists in history, Newton, Faraday, Pascal, were men of deep faith. They saw science not as a way to disprove God, but as a way to understand his creation better." Then Barron paused, his voice softening but filled with conviction. "When you say we don't need God because we have I think you missed the real point. AI may help us live longer or make life easier, but it will never answer the deepest questions of the human heart. Why do we love? Why do we feel guilt? Why do we dream of eternity? Those aren't engineering problems. Those are questions for the soul, and only God can give us those answers." As Barron finished speaking, the room was silent. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they've heard something that just might change the way they see the world. Barron took a slow, steady breath as the room watched in silence, and then, with quiet confidence, he began to challenge the very foundation of Dr. Blake's argument. "Now, Dr. Blake," he said, "you claim that believing in God is irrational, a sign of weakness. But let me ask you something. If believing that an all-powerful creator designed the universe is irrational, then what do you call believing that everything, all life, all order, all beauty, came from nothing, by accident, without cause?" The professor shifted uncomfortably behind the podium, but Barron pressed on, his voice calm but strong. "You argue that consciousness, our ability to think, to love, to dream, somehow arose from lifeless, unconscious matter. But even the most advanced AI in the world can't feel love. It can't choose good over evil. It can't sacrifice itself for a stranger. So where did those things come from, Dr. Blake? Are we really supposed to believe they are just random sparks in our brain? Or could they point to something deeper, something designed, something sacred?" A murmur ran through the crowd as people exchanged thoughtful glances. "And let me say this," Barron continued, "you mock people of faith for believing in God, but at the same time you believe, without proof, that everything we see and are, the entire universe, just appeared on its own. Isn't that a kind of faith too? You have faith in chance. You have faith in randomness. You trust that life, against impossible odds, just happened. And yet you call our faith irrational?" The professor's usual smirk had completely vanished. His eyes darted around, searching for an answer, but Barron gave him no room to escape. "With all due respect, sir," Barron said firmly, "it takes far more blind faith to believe that nothing created everything than to believe that someone greater than us created it all with purpose." The room was silent, heavy with realization. Many in the audience who had laughed before now sat still, reflecting on Barron's words. A young man's quiet challenge that had shaken even the strongest walls of intellectual arrogance. Barron paused for a moment, scanning the room. His gaze was steady, yet there was a spark of something deeper, conviction. Then his voice, calm but carrying weight, filled the silent hall. "You know, Dr. Blake," Barron began, "you say that faith is a sign of weakness, that people who believe in God do so because they're afraid or uneducated. But I'd argue the opposite." The room leaned in as Barron continued. "It's easy to follow the crowd when everyone agrees with you. It's easy to mock things you don't understand, to laugh at faith when you've never really wrestled with the big questions. But let me ask you this. What takes more strength? To say you believe in something greater than yourself when people are ready to mock you? Or to hide behind intellectual superiority because you're afraid of admitting there might be something beyond human understanding?" A murmur moved through the audience, a ripple of recognition. Barron didn't stop. His voice grew stronger, more heartfelt. "You ask why God allows pain and suffering. You say that if God existed, he wouldn't let bad things happen. But let me flip that around for you, sir. Isn't it often through pain that we become better, stronger, more compassionate people? Without struggle, how would we know what love, sacrifice, and kindness really mean?" He took a step forward, locking eyes with Dr. Blake. Think about it. A parent doesn't shield their child from every scraped knee or broken heart. They know those moments shape their child into someone wiser, stronger, more loving. Why would God, the ultimate father, do any less for us? The room was dead silent now. Not a whisper, not a shuffle of papers, just Barron's voice and the weight of his words hanging in the air. And let me say this, Barron added, his voice softening but growing even more personal. I've seen people walk through incredible loss, losing family, fighting cancer, standing in the middle of tragedy, and still hold on to their faith. You call that weakness? I call that strength. Because it's easy to believe in nothing, but it takes real courage to believe in God when life gives you every reason to walk away. He paused, taking a breath before finishing. So if you think faith is for the weak, maybe, just maybe, you've never really seen what faith looks like when it's tested by fire. As Barron Trump finished his final words, a heavy silence filled the grand conference hall. You could almost hear a pin drop. The man who had spent years mocking anyone who believed in God, the man who had written bestsellers claiming faith was a weakness, Dr. Jonathan Blake, stood frozen, gripping the podium as if it was the only thing holding him up. His face, once so confident and smug, was now pale and tense. His hands trembled slightly. For a moment he opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. It was as if Barron's calm and sharp reasoning had taken the wind out of his sails. You see, Dr. Blake had built his reputation on being the smartest man in the room, the man with all the answers. But now, as the weight of Barron's questions and quiet confidence settled over him, it was clear to everyone watching, he had no answer. The students, many of whom had laughed earlier at Dr. Blake's sarcastic jokes, were now staring wide-eyed, not at him, but at Barron. A few students even exchanged glances, some whispering things like, "Did you hear that? I've never seen anyone stand up to him like that." Others simply nodded, their faces showing a mix of surprise and admiration. Finally, from the back of the room, an older professor, a man with gray hair and kind eyes, stood slowly and said, "Maybe it's time we remember that science and faith don't have to be enemies." That was all it took. Suddenly, the hall erupted in applause, not because Barron had embarrassed Dr. Blake, but because he had stood up for something bigger than himself, for truth, for faith, for the freedom to believe. And in that moment, Barron Trump wasn't just a young student anymore. He was a voice for everyone who had ever been mocked for believing in something greater. After the conference ended and most people had left the hall, Dr. Jonathan Blake remained standing alone at the podium, staring down at his notes, or maybe just staring into himself, reflecting on what had just happened. A few moments later, as Barron Trump gathered his things to leave, he quietly approached the professor. There was no pride or arrogance in Barron's eyes, only calm respect. Dr. Blake looked up, and for the first time that day, there was a softness in his voice. He said, "You know, Barron, in all my years of teaching and debating, no one has ever made me question my own arrogance like you did today." Barron gave a gentle smile and replied, "Sometimes, Professor, the strongest arguments for faith are made by those who try the hardest to destroy it." The older man nodded slowly, his proud posture now humbled. "Maybe," he whispered, "the real closed minds aren't the ones who believe in God, but the ones who mock those who do." Friends, there's a powerful lesson here for all of us. In today's world, faith is often treated like a weakness, something to be laughed at or dismissed. But as Barron showed us that day, it takes real strength and courage to stand firm in what you believe, even when others mock you. Faith and reason are not enemies. Some of the greatest minds in history, people like Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein, believed in something greater than themselves. They knew what we sometimes forget, that there are questions science may never answer, and that's where faith begins. So let me ask you, on a scale from 1 to 10, how powerful do you think Barron's stand for faith was? Let me know in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that uplift and inspire. God bless you, and God bless America.